Right. Well, it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight, Nikki Wright. She was the executive director of Sea Change Marine Conservation Society from 1998 to just last year. So a long history with that society, which is a non-profit charitable society working with community partners on marine education, conservation, and restoration in the Salish Sea. So with that, I'll hand it over to Nikki, and she can tell you all about the society and all their projects. Thanks, Nikki.
Thank you, Phil. I want to say thank you to you and to the membership for inviting me tonight. It's fun to prepare for this kind of presentation, because usually it's, trying to get the facts right about what I'm trying to educate about. And this time it's just singing the praises of thousands of people who have come forth since 1998 when we were first formed. And it's joy to do something like this. So thank you for the opportunity. I want to first acknowledge that I'm on the unceded territory of the Wasanic people. I'm speaking from Brentwood Bay. And that's been sort of the base for sea change activities for many years. And now it's based in North Saanich. So we're still on the peninsula. I want to always begin my presentations with honoring Trish Farrell, because she basically put the bug in my ear about how to approach marine conservation, education, and restoration in the Salish Sea. We were speaking on a beach called North Cove in Thetis Island. Before we formed as an organization, there was another organization we were doing mostly marine education. And we were speaking to high school students who had gotten themselves on sailing vessels and sailboats from Vancouver during spring breaks. And this went on for 5 years. And they would go into the Gulf Islands, live on these boats, do conflict resolution and everything else that's required for teenagers to be on boats in small spaces. And it was a real learning curve for them. And we were part of a whole collection of educators that spoke to them over the week. And as the years went by, and we would do this every March when it would snow or rain or sleet or whatever, we'd form our base camp in Thetis Island. And soon enough, we persuaded the lifeboat flotilla. It was called Life Was Leadership Initiative for Earth. This was back in 96, 97, that we wanted more time, and we would have a blast with these high school students. And we do role playing and all kinds of things about what it would mean to conserve the marine environment. And it was a lot of fun. But Trish was a major player in all of this. And she's seen here on the left speaking with cedar boughs. And she's from the First Nations up near Deep Bay, north of Nanaimo. And she was speaking when she was about 10. She remembered the herring coming in so thick she could almost walk on them. And of course, they would put the boughs out, either cedar boughs or other kinds of boughs. I don't know which, but cedar was what we had. So that's what she demonstrated with. And of course, the herring would come and lay their roe or their eggs on the branches. And then she had this wonderful story about sneaking behind grandmother's back, who had eyes on the back of her head, to eat the roe because it tasted so good to her. And as I heard her speak, it occurred to me, what could we do in the marine environment that would wake up people to what is there? Back in those days, I don't know if Phil would agree with me or not, it was difficult to convince the powers that be that we had any influence for the positive in the marine environment. There was a lot of attention being put in freshwater systems and salmon habitat. But once they hit the saltwater or the brackish water of estuaries, the story kind of stopped there. And so we were looking for ways to bridge that gap. And I was talking to Doug Bifford. Hopefully many of you know him. He was working for BC Parks. He said, have you thought of eelgrass? And that started our journey. So in 1998, we were formed, and we started thinking about eelgrass. It took us a couple of years to actually get the support we needed to plant 1,800 shoots in Sneakwith or a Todd Inlet. And we chose eelgrass because it is such a good segue, especially for property owners who live along the shoreline, but also for everybody else because it's got so much life in it. And even though Sea Change has been emphasizing eelgrass as that medium to talk to people about the oceans, we understand that it's part of one huge system of which, you know, all of you in the audience know. So I'm speaking to the converted, I know, but I just want to say that eelgrass is just part of the story. And it does serve really well as an underground garden that people can relate to. So we would speak to people about, oh, can we go plant it? And I said, well, you don't have to plant it, but you wouldn't have to plant it if you could protect it by not pouring fertilizers so much on your lawns. Maybe cut back on the fertilizers and think about the herbicides and the pesticides that you're using. This is coastal property owners, because the crabs and the fish are actually being affected by what you're putting on your garden. So it's just an example of how we could do education, conservation, restoration with this wonderful plant, which all of us fell in love with pretty quickly. And of course, the nearshore environment is so rich. I've heard that the herring have started to really produce their eggs now. So that's good news. In some areas, it's very, very rich. So everything from forage fish all the way up to the whales and beyond relies on the habitats that are in the nearshore and coastal regions, that if you don't have the habitat, the critters aren't there. So everything I've learned, everything I have been inspired by, everything that Sea Change has taken off on since 1998 started in this place called Sneakwith. It's a Senchatan word for the place of the blue grouse. And most people know it as a BC Park or Todd Inlet. So that's where we did our first transplant. On the far shore, not in this picture, there are 2 research buoys that we put in place to protect that eelgrass bed. And we did make a mistake by planting a little bit too high, but because the infamous geese got those during low tides, but there's still, the plants that are in deeper water are still there. It's a patchy bed, most likely because it's very shady over there. So we learned a lot, but everything else that we've embarked upon has really germinated in this very special place. It was a wintering village for the Sartla peoples until about 1901, when the Portland Vancouver Cement Company came in and started mining limestone for cement. And so that whole shoreline area there was the site of that village. And of course, it was done without the permission of the West Sanic people. It's really devastating to look at that picture. It makes me sad even today. So you can see how not only is it deforested, but it's down to very basic rock. And this is what it looked like on the left for over 100 years. There was hardly any life. There were no barnacles on that shoreline. This is the area as you walk down from Wallace Drive. So just down that pathway to the shoreline. That's where that is. And I was sitting on the beach one day after one of our environmental education programs thinking, if we don't interfere with this, it's going to remain this way. Nothing is going to change it. And yes, it was a BC park, and what I was advised is kind of just let it be. And I thought, by 2014, 15, I thought we've got to do something about this. So by 2017, we were able to put Well, we graded it. We got rid of the, sorry, I have a dog that's causing problems here. Contaminated soils and sediment, and put down sand and rocky sediment that held onto the shore. It's a very low energy area, so it doesn't receive waves even in wintertime. So that's not going anywhere. And then a few years later, about a couple of years ago, we had a wonderful student from the Restoration of Natural Systems come to us and say, I'm interested in Sneakwith, how can I help? And we started talking about crushed oyster shells and how the purpose of our original restoration of this shoreline was to help bring back the shellfish harvesting cultural practices of the Sartlip in particular. And I didn't realize when you do restoration, especially in a growing population like we have in the CRD, that it was Family Day shortly after, it's just an example, shortly after we did this restoration, it's Family Day. And all these folks, these families started coming down. And then over the years, it's been really incredible recreational use of the shore. And that wasn't our original intention. So, you know, it's very interesting how that happens. My original intention, and Sea Change's original intention, was to try to bring back the biodiversity that was so badly impacted by that industrial limestone mining. But nevertheless, we're still are proceeding on that path of how to bring back, especially the shellfish, the clams and the oysters that the Sartlip would regularly harvest. And so we decided on shell hash, which is the crushed oyster shell, and deposited in the upper intertidal and the lower subtidal areas. And we had been monitoring the site for years before the shell hash was there, and then been monitoring since to see quite an increase in the larvae and juvenile stages of both native and Japanese oysters. So that's a good news story. The picture on the bottom is where I'm considering putting oyster shell hash with a thin layer of sediment underneath from where the restored shoreline is all the way to the creek, so south of the restored area. One of the reasons being, of course, sea level rise and trying to save the maple trees, especially that are closer to the Todd Creek, or Wachacha it's called, because they will eventually fail. The root systems are being affected by climate change. There isn't much boat wake there, but there is rising sea level. So I'm getting money together there, and we're going to have a feasting event, I think, with the Westanic people, probably in June or July. So on your right, there is the totem pole, or the welcoming figure, that was designed and carved by the late Charles Elliott, who just passed a few months ago. And on the left is the welcoming figure that used to be there in Sneakwith, that was either stolen or vandalized. And we're thinking to have an event, again, we've had some in the past, with especially the elders of the Westanic communities, so that I can ask them one more time, is this what you'd like to have happen on the shore? It was told to me by Simon Smith Jr. when I had approached the Lands Committee at Sartlip about the restoration of the shoreline. He was said twice to me in different circumstances. He said, don't forget the shells. And I have not forgotten the shells. It just takes one statement to sink in, to change a restoration plan. And I'd like to have a feasting event to just consult with the community again, just to make sure we're on the right page and not move too fast, because people like me get really passionate. And we just want to, move ahead, especially if the resources are there. The other thing is we were a little discouraged after we did this shore restoration, and the coastal engineer that was helping us came to us and said, well, have you considered a 100-year plan? And all of us just had this humongous sigh of relief. It doesn't have to happen tomorrow, as long as we're on the trajectory of recovering the life that was in that estuary. So when I start thinking of 100 years, of course, I won't be seeing it, and my daughter won't be seeing it, but I think with a lot of resources and goodwill, the whole estuary could be recovered. So some of the other work that we've done over the years, I think we started planting eelgrass in the Cowichan Estuary around 2005, and stopped doing it a number of years ago because I realized that they were not succeeding very well. And I think it had a lot to do with, first off, the forestry practices that happened for so long in the watershed, which caused channelization of the Coxsala and the Cowichan. So when we had these huge storm events, there's a humongous amount of volume of water with sediment coming down in the estuary. Plus those channels are always moving south to north and north to south. So we gave up on that, went to Genoa Bay and did planting there. Until Sherry Ayres, who works for the Cowichan tribes, called me and said, are you interested in the whole watershed approach that we're doing and thinking about a massive eelgrass transplant? And I had my misgivings, but a lot of experts came to the table. So since about 4 years ago, we planted about 25,000 shoots, and the majority of the sites that we continually have been planting and designing from the north of the estuary towards the south with all the community members, they are surviving, and it's quite a miracle in my eyes. So we'll see if we can continue that over time. Roberts Bay is another example of a shoreline that desperately needs help. So you can see the houses on the right, and to the right of that picture, to the north of the picture, is a retaining wall, a cement retaining wall that was built about 30 years ago, and then houses are behind it. The picture on the left is what's left of a very large, formerly healthy salt marsh, and it's receding and being squeezed by the storms, and by squeezed meant that the edge, the outer edge, the seaward edge is eroding very quickly, and the, I'm sorry, did I say that right? The seaward edge is eroding very quickly, and the shoreward edge has no place to go. So, except if we could protect the upper estuary and then build protective pilings in front of that edge, we could mitigate some of the wave energy coming towards it, and then fill in those areas with salt marsh plants. So this was just this March, with a willow fence to help with erosion of Mermaid Creek, just up from the picture, the first picture, and community volunteers planting in the upper salt marsh. It's related to Sneakwith in the sense that we're compiling the indigenous knowledge of this site. There was a wintering village, again, at this site. Anywhere where there's a shoreline in the CRD, there was a village, either a wintering village or a village that was there all year round. So I'm trying to coalesce that knowledge, because when we do restoration plans, it'd be good to know what the baseline is. And to me, the original baseline is the biodiversity that was there when the first peoples lived here. I mean, lived here full-time in villages is what I meant. So that was just a little taste of what the major programs and projects are. And then this one was funded by the Ocean Protection plan money called the Coastal Restoration Fund. And we were able to receive $1.3 million in 2017 to basically do 3 activities in 4 regions. And those 4 regions were the Gulf Islands, Howe Sound, Burrard Inlet, and Seashelt Inlet. And I'm just finishing up the final report for this work. So it all started with community collaborations. We would have regional coordinators who lived and worked in each of those regions, and consult with the community, including First Nations. And the map on your right is identification of sites that people were concerned about and thought that work could be done. And so we created a declaration of respect that we presented to the First Nations in whose territory we were going to work. And it was basically a simple statement that we intended to work in agreement with their protocols and protect any information that we received that they did not want to have distributed. Then we would go out, we'd have those sites, and there were hundreds of sites suggested. So we'd have a working committee, a technical committee, would sit down and do the research, and then we'd do habitat surveys to see what was really out there and what the problems were, and could we address them in the 5 years that we had received funding. So this is just an example of a survey done at Lyle Harbor. This is one of our most successful eelgrass transplants, because on the lower left is a dock there that was removed, didn't have to be there, and it was removed by community volunteers who very willingly helped us out. That was removed, and an eelgrass bed that was continuously present could expand in that direction. So it's doing very well. Many of the sites, however, are chosen because they are so degraded, and many of those sites were former log boom areas. So that's a side scan sonar. The line there is the travel of the boat as it goes through with the side scan sonar device, and you could see all those little toothpick figures of the logs. And this is oftentimes what the seabed looks like. This is in Cleo Bay up north, but we are really working with degraded seabeds that are changed physically, chemically, and biologically when the wood from the logs that are sitting on the surface of the water move down the water column and sit there for long periods of time. So those areas that have low circulation, the damage is really quite severe, and eelgrass is not able to recolonize in those areas unless they get help. I mean, if there was even a small patch of eelgrass, you'd know that eventually it could regrow the area, but we're trying to get those small patches and expand on them, or even look at patches that don't exist yet, if that makes sense. So we did a lot of eelgrass transplants. There were 20 sites for the last 5 years, oftentimes such as the Cotton Bay on the west side of Gambier Island has room for many, many more transplants. So when we have resources again, we'll probably revisit the site. So some of those 20 sites have been revisited quite a few times. We did debris removals in places where eelgrass could grow if the debris had been removed. So on the left is Degdin Bay off of Gabriola Island, and on the right is a huge fishing net that we removed from Seashelt Inlet. There's marine riparian restoration. This was the most dramatic one. This is just so lovely. This is a cemetery on Thetis Island. And obviously on the left, you can see the bank is failing quite severely. The path is going to go, and eventually the graves that are on the left side in the picture are going to start dropping into the sea. On the right, this is the monitoring that happened about 2 years ago. It even looks taller now. And this was, it was such a wonderful weekend. We had Dave Polster come and do a big presentation about doing the kind of work that he does with natural vegetation. And then the next day with 40 volunteers, we actually installed that. And so it's been a huge success story, thanks to Dave and those volunteers and the Thetis Island Nature Conservancy. So one of our big challenges when we're looking at the near shore is boat anchorages. And this is a picture taken in Australia, just to really show from an eagle's point of view what anchor chains do to the seabed. That's an otherwise vegetated habitat there, but all those gray circles is scouring effects on that vegetation, and it just doesn't get a chance because those anchor chains are constantly rotating around the boat as the tides change and as the winds change direction, and they scour the seabed so nothing can survive. Not if you don't have the habitat, the critters are very rare indeed. And so we're trying to address that by several things. And this is where I'm kind of coming into the conservation piece of our work. First, we have about 50 signs now that are designed like this. It shows the person where they are, and then a little blurb on the importance of eelgrass. And please don't anchor anywhere closer to the shore than -7 meters. Now, the problem with this, of course, is that people oftentimes anchor in a bed and then read the sign because these are all on land. So another way to deal with it is to suggest voluntary eelgrass protection zones. And this has been done in Port Townsend for the last 20+ years with great success. There's a very healthy eelgrass bed right in front of the town with about, well, I'd say more than 5. We've just put 5 in these different sites, but they have about maybe 10 buoys out there. And it's done with a voluntary attitude, asking boaters to acquiesce to the eelgrass situation, to please stay off. But boaters talk to each other, and I kind of equate it with jaywalking in Victoria. Very little jaywalking in Victoria, at least now, might change because people frown on it. And I think that peer pressure has a lot to do with why voluntary zones can work over time. So we have them in Mannion Bay, Cowichan Bay, Gibson's Harbor, and we might have one, not in Montague Harbor, where in front of the marina, but further north of that, because there's a very beautiful eelgrass bed. Then there's the midline mooring system. So for people who cannot, or for some reason won't move their mooring blocks away from eelgrass beds and continue to be moored in eelgrass beds, there's a very simple solution that is not very expensive. It's called a midline mooring system, where the chain is actually suspended. It's a rope instead of a chain, suspended in the water column, and it keeps the scouring, it keeps it from scouring the seabed. And we've watched that happen in Ford Cove on Hornby Island and Clam Bay on Thetis, and also in Mannion Bay off of Bowen Island. So our next project is going to be challenging for the next 4 years. It's called Resilient Estuaries, or Restoring Resilient Estuaries in the Salish Sea. And over the last 25+ years, we have been following the mapping surveys. When we survey eelgrass, for example, for the Islands Trust, we would spot those places that could be restored, and we'd go out and look a little bit further and see what the chances of restoration were. Or we consult with the community and get those places on a map and go do habitat surveys. But knowing this, the immediacy of climate change, the intensity of the storms, and the quickly rising sea level, I have come to realize that not everything can be conserved. And it makes me sad to say that, but what I think might be more strategically vital to pay attention to is those estuaries that, because of their features, might have a greater resiliency to sea level rise and storms, so that the habitats can move shoreward. And so we're going to start a project in 3 regions, which will be the Gulf Islands and Salish Inlet, House Sound and Seychelles and Sunshine Coast, so that whole area there. Do our research, do surveys, and actually conserve and restore as much as possible those areas that have a higher likelihood of maintaining, I can't say a high level, but at least a level of biodiversity for the future. So what are those factors? Well, right off the bat, it's relatively undeveloped back shores. So we'll probably be working a lot in BC Parks and Parks Canada and conservancy areas, places that have been conserved, those kinds of areas. That's just one example. Another one is habitat connectivity. There's a freshwater stream or creek with forage fish spawning areas, with eelgrass, with kelp, with mussels, with fucus, with wildlife, bird habitat, like the whole, the whole banana. If it already has that, then how can we conserve it and put our energies into restoration and conservation plans? And part of that would be lightening the human footprint, such as this. So I obviously don't think that the shorelines that have their riparian vegetation removed, that have been deforested, that have been developed with docks and gangways, and have been modified with rocks or walls or whatever, are going to be resilient. And there's lots of reasons for it. All right, here's a plea for you. I know that many of you might be interested. Many of you are educators. We had a program in Sneakwith for many years, and before that it was at Royal Roads, right down there at the lagoon. It was called Eco Rowing. And as years progressed, we decided to have it in Sneakwith because it's a very sheltered area. That's why the wintering village was there. Even when it's raining, it's very, very protected. And so elementary all the way up to 8th graders could come for a whole day program. And it would be a mix of Indigenous and Western science. It would be rowing or paddling on the water. It would be learning ethnobotany or restoring the lands that are in Sneakwith. It was an excellent program. And then COVID came along. And I haven't been instrumental in reviving that program because I think it's time, many of you might agree, that it be Indigenous led. And I'm wondering if there's anybody in the audience who would be interested in having a conversation with me about helping revive the program in partnership, in collaboration, in whatever relationship is meaningful to the First Nations, to make it for both the larger school community and for First Nations schools. So if anybody's in the audience, I will give you my email. These are the kinds of projects, the kind of learnings that went on. We'd look at water quality and what was living in the inlet, and we'd do a long-term little monitoring data sheet. It was really an excellent program. There's a quote here that I'd love for you to look at because it's done by a person that really inspired me during the Harper years. When Stephen Harper was in office and we had a Liberal government in the province, it was very, very difficult to do the work that we're trying to do. And it was very discouraging. So I'm just gonna have you read it because it pertains to people like you. I highly recommend that book. He's got his finger on the pulse as far as how nonprofits operate. We may not be talking to each other that much, especially globally, and even even in the Salish Sea, it's hard for us to communicate much. We're always so busy, but we are millions and millions of us working for social justice, Indigenous rights, and the health of the world. And I always remind children, especially, because they're getting the news and it's in their bodies, it's in their minds. It's why they're so anxious and depressed, to give them the message that there are millions of people working to change what they hear on the radio. So I want to thank you for your attention, and I'm really eager to hear your questions because it means something to me to speak with you. I'm going to keep my screen on just for a minute, and if you could unmute yourself and talk to me. If you need some information, I have some more slides, and so I was wondering, Phil, if it's okay if we just keep the screen share on for a few more minutes, if there's any questions.
Sure, yeah. The people can also put their questions into the chat.
Right.
I see there are a couple there already.
Great.
Should I?
Can you read them? Because I can't.
Sure, yeah. First, from Jennifer Sutton, where do you get the mature eelgrass for transplanting?
So one of the important elements of restoration is to mimic the conditions of the transplant from the area. I didn't say that right. What we want to do is find donor plants as close to the transplant site as possible, so that the bathymetry, or the depth, and the ecotype, or the type of eelgrass that it is, it changes its morphology, or its width and its length according to the depth. So if you take eelgrass that's growing in deeper waters and put it in shallower waters, it is not going to survive, because its genetic makeup is to grow in deeper waters. So a donor site is usually close to the transplant site. And we have a way of harvesting that creates small spaces, bare spaces, that recover in about 6 months. I've learned everything I know from the first person listed here, Cynthia Durrance, who had been working, 98, she had been working in eelgrass beds, doing compensation projects for DFO for at least 30 years. So, and I still work with her very closely. So this isn't coming from Google. This is coming from listening to an expert who's helped me tremendously in the field and inside. I hope that answered your question. I can go into many details and don't need to. I just want to say one thing. Cynthia and I are working on a primer for groups that are interested in doing eelgrass restoration, because it's not rocket science. It just needs to be, there's certain rules that absolutely have to be followed, and we don't want to go backwards. It took us a long time to get the credibility to do this work, and I would love for that to continue with other grassroots organizations. So if we write the primer and maybe do even some field training, we'll know that those mistakes don't get made again.
Okay, Nikki, there's another question. It's sort of related. How do you plant the eelgrass?
I have a video on that, but we don't have time, do we, Phil? What's our time limit?
There's no limit. People
can just drop off when they're.
Yeah, it's not like walking out of the room, you know. It's
okay. Okay, all right. Before I answer that question, you can contact me through the Sea Change Marine Conservation Society website, or if you want to talk by email, it's Nikki, Nikki, at seachangelife.org. especially if you're interested in environmental education. Thanks. All right, here we go. It's a rhizomatic plant. So many of you are horticulturalists or at least gardeners, so you know what I'm talking about. It grows clonally. So that underground stem that you see on the right gives rise to new shoots. And so the question was, how do we plant it? Okay, so we collect it with the size of the rhizome that you see on the left is about the size, 3 nodes at least, and about 3 centimeters long, so that we can give the plant a chance. The rhizome is where the energy is stored for the plant. We plant in groups of 10. We bind it with ungalvanized steel washer so that it doesn't wash away. The ungalvanized steel washer rusts eventually and helps mitigate a little bit on a small scale the sulfides that are in the sediment from the log debris. So that's basically how we plant. We plant in a design of 10 shoots per meter squared most of the time. Sometimes it's double density. And according to a transect line, so there's a definite pattern to the planting. So when we come back every 6 months to look at how it's doing for shoot density and area coverage, we can see how the shape of the bed is changing. So that's kind of a Reader's Digest thing of how these plants are done. That was the video that I wanted to show you. Okay. All right, I'm going to close my screen so that I can actually see you.
Okay.
So, thank you.
Right. So there's another question from Jim Wisnia. Wonderful presentation. Your house sound map did not extend to Squamish Estuary. Can you tell us what's happening there?
Oh, excellent question. Thank you. Poor Squamish Estuary. We have tried several times. There's one transplant that's in front of the reserve that is doing okay. It's hanging on. That poor estuary has been so badly damaged by industry, mostly log storage and logging in the past. We have mapped, we have tried several times to see if there's any other eelgrass besides the transplant, and there is not. So unless it's capped, which means a clean sediment is put in and you start all over, which I would not recommend for an entire estuary. It's sort of a sacrificial industrial wasteland, I'm sorry to say, under the water.
Another comment from Rod Mitchell. BC Park, Middlenatch Island has limited access for boats to visit. One of them is a small bay with a lovely eelgrass bed. This bay is where many visitors anchor, some overnight. From your experience, do you think BC Parks might be willing to install seabed-friendly strategies?
Moving on, next question. I have a huge amount of frustration, and because I'm an NGO and I'm no longer the executive director, I can speak my mind. I know BC Parks has very, very, very limited resources, but in the years that I've worked with them, especially the last 20 years, I find a reluctance to do anything that might disturb boaters. You really see this out in Sydney Island. There's this fantasy that the boat anchoring there is not affecting the eelgrass. I think public pressure would do it. I don't think an NGO like myself or ourselves can really have much influence. But if the people using the parks or even the boaters, there is the power point or the pressure point that parks would listen to. So that would be my strategies. Have boaters say, you know, it's not that expensive. And if they're already anchored there permanently and their block is already there, it's not expensive work to do. And I just recommend that. It comes from the public. I know that was a dissatisfying answer, but there's a lot of frustration behind it.
Okay. Melissa Anderson asked, so there's no propagation, just a straight transplant from donor site to restoration site?
You mean to propagate it
Right.
on land or in a saltwater environment? On land would be very expensive because you have to have the infrastructure. It was done in Squim in Washington. And it would be my dream that if we could have an underwater nursery, it would be lovely. But that means getting a lease on the shoreline and being able to have the right kind of conditions, and then the ecotype would have to be the proper ecotype for the transplant. But it's still a fantasy of mine that it would be lovely. People do talk about seeding because it does propagate by seed as well. It does not succeed, as far as we know, on the West Coast as it does on the East. There's different conditions.
Well, it sounds like the way you're doing it now, just taking from a donor site and moving some, and then it refills the patches. So it sounds like that seems to work.
Yeah, we do monitor every 6 months, and we look at the donor site as well as a transplant. So we've got good eyes on both.
Right.
Excuse me, is there any possibility or discussion about partnering with First Nations who could perhaps provide an appropriate setting? And, they seem to have a great deal more influence in environmental matters these days. And I wondered if a joint partnership could really do something.
So a setting for propagating donor
Yes, an
plants?
eelgrass nursery, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. We're slowly making progress because First Nations have a greater capacity now to go out as guardians and look over the waters and guard their territorial waters. And so we are doing some eelgrass survey training. And with this resilient estuaries project coming up, there's even greater possibilities of working. So it's a slow process of relationship building, and it is happening. So I'm hopeful that your suggestion could be a reality at some point. It's a good one.
Okay, another comment here, an eye-opener of a presentation. With such a positive perspective. That's from Monica Wynn.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. And let's see, Jean Gapsis. How does one become a volunteer eelgrass planter?
Just contact us. You can do that through contacting me by email. And the problem is that we don't have any planned at the moment, but if we can get you on a list and then we can contact you. Could be Cowichan, it could be the Gulf Islands. It's going to be a little bit of time before the next one because of the funding and that.
Thank you. I'll do that.
Thank you.
I have fond memories of working on your first transplant in Todd Inlet.
Yeah.
Going
That was
down with
fun.
clumps
I
of,
just want to say something about that because I learned so much from that first transplant, not only about the plants and all that, but I was still a diver then, and I was coming up. The first day, it took us 2 days. We were really slow with 1,800 plants. So the first day we planted, and then I went into the water to look at how the plants were doing. And I came up, and the volunteers were on the shoreline. I heard a lot of laughing and a lot of talking. And it occurred to me then, back in, I guess that was our first transplant in 2000, occurred to me the restoration is happening on the shore. And if that restoration of relationships can happen, where people are connecting again around the marine environment, eventually, I would hope people like me would be out of a job. because the restoration has to happen with our mindset, with our worldview about how we treat the world. Once we get that, the restoration and the trying to mimic nature in all the ways we're trying to save her, she can do very well if we just get out of the way. So I just say that most times because I would love for restoration not to have to be in the limelight, but it has to be because our worldview is so off balance.
And Rod Mitchell has a comment. Thank you very much for your presentation and thoughts on our questions.
Thank you.
And Jacques Sirois, how much
Hi.
damage is done to eelgrass beds by resident invasive Canada geese?
Very good. Severe. Like the brants come along and they eat eelgrass, hopefully with herring roe on it, and then they leave. But our resident Canadian goose does not leave, right? It was a mistake to import them from elsewhere. So that's one of the problems, is that many of our geese now don't go anywhere all year round. And one of my favorite rules that I made up after our first transplant in Sneakwith was always plant deeper than the longest neck of the oldest goose. That's what we learned from that transplant. So yes, I have watched them and they're just ravenously attacking eelgrass. They take it all the way, they pull the shoot so vigorously that the rhizome is out as well. So the eelgrass, if they've really done their usual job, won't be able to recolonize itself for a longer period of time. Whereas the brant don't do that, right? The brant just eat the blades hopefully with the herring roe on it.
Jean Dawson asks, is eelgrass planted underwater like rice?
Yeah, we do use divers.
Divers, yeah.
We have to plant those rhizomes in. So it's not a cheap, it's not cheap work. And that's why everybody says to me, why don't you try seeding? And I wish that we could, because we could do a whole lot more work, but it does depend on commercial divers. Is that the question does that answer the question? Is that okay?
I think so. You have to be divers, yes, because it's
Yeah.
subtidal work, isn't it?
That's right.
Yeah. Don Scott, you mentioned that you'd like Indigenous people to lead program. How many Indigenous people are volunteering with your organization now and participating in the transplant?
Good question. I love those kinds of questions because they're challenging. The capacity for the nations on the peninsula is extremely limiting. And there's all kinds of reasons for it. And I have lived here for a long time. So I think it's not about volunteering, number one. They need to be paid. And we're hoping with this project, the Resilient Estuaries, that we can do that. So there's the economic reason. There's lots of other reasons. Having said that, as I said before, there is more money and resources being put into all the First Nations, especially the 19 First Nations that are being affected by increased freighter traffic. And so with those programs, there's boats being built, or not built, bought. There's guardianship programs that weren't there before. And there's an interest in certain kinds of training. So we're using the relationships that we built over the last 20 some odd years and making slow inroads into what we could do further to keep these collaborations healthy and alive and beneficial for the community. So Sneakwith, I'm in touch with Will Morris, who I knew as he was a young diver when I first knew him many years ago. We're talking about the feasting event, for example, in Sneakwith, and the restoration that could happen and those kinds of things. So it's slow and it's not something that happens overnight. And I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful that those relationships can keep moving in the right direction with the right intent.
And Alan Campbell says, thanks for your hopeful, thoughtful presentation and for your passion for restoring eelgrass as part of our coastal marine environment.
Here, here.
Thank you.
So any other questions for Nikki? If you'd like to unmute yourself and ask a question, if not,
Show your face. I'd love to see some faces before we say goodnight. Is that possible? Or everybody's in their pajamas and
oh,
bad hair day? Thank
there's
you.
Jacques.
There's Jacques.
Hey, thank you. Thank you,
Oh,
Nikki.
it's good to see you.
Nikki, the world is a better place because of people like you.
I feel the same way about you. And
You and your projects. We love you very, very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Jacques. Thank you. Thank you, all of you. It's a pleasure to speak with you. You know, I have to say, I'm not leaving Sea Change. I'm just leaving the director's chair. And one of the reasons why I don't want to leave is because of people like you. It's every time I walk into a room and, you know, we share information about all the different ways that we're working to save this poor planet. It's such it's a circular energetic thing that happens. A circular economy. This is a circular conservation movement that goes on. I think we build on each other's hope and our hard work and our good intent. And it's just addictive. I am addictive to all of you. I'm talking about all of you as a community. There's millions of us all around the world. And we have to keep telling that to the young people. We really do, because they don't see it.
Great. Well,
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nikki.
Thank you.
I'll
Thanks,
just
Nikki.
All right. Good night.
Night.
thank you all
Thank you.
for attending. I'll just stop the recording.
Great,